Good morning. Today we are continuing with our series on living scripture, a term that both indicates a verb and an adjective. Scripture as a living thing that must be lived by us. How to live the essence of sacred revelation in a way that remains relevant, relatable, and ever dynamic. So for this purpose, we are exploring especially rare, not so well-known sections of scripture. I'm bringing them to light in an attempt of serving those sections and embracing them on a day-to-day basis. So today we'll turn to the Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upaniṣad, one of the older Upanishads, treatises, metaphysical, esoteric treatises. A very interesting verse on the topic of desire as the origin of everything else that unfolds after that. So it says like this in Sanskrit first: kāmamaya evāyaṃ puruṣa sa yathā-kāmo bhavati tat-kratur bhavati yat-kratur bhavati kurute tat abhisaṃpadyate. So the translation is, the living being is indeed made of desire. As is his desire, so is his intention. As is his intention, so is the action he performs. And as is the action he performs, so is that which he attains. So here we have a very classical sequence that we may need to be reminded of on a daily basis, because many times we end up entangled in what we attain, in the fruits we are tasting, whether they are bitter or not, and we lose sight of what's the cycle behind that, what takes us to taste a particular fruit. So this particular verse of Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upaniṣad is mentioning this sequence. It all begins with desire, it follows by intention. Intention takes us to a certain action, and action takes us to a particular fruit. Of course, there are many other ways of depicting this particular unfolding, but this is one of them, a very classical one. Desire, intention, action, fruit. But it all begins with desire. In other words, this verse invites us to be introspective about which are our desires, what I am actually desiring. Because if not, many times we end up acting on a more mechanical way without acknowledging what's impulsing our actions. Or sometimes we end up lamenting on the fruits of our action without, again, seeing what's behind the fruit, what's behind the action, what's behind even the intention. Sometimes we speak about intention. I have good intention, I have this intention, I didn't have bad intention, that's totally fine. But still, what's the desire behind? And of course, we can even go beyond desire and say, okay, desire sprouts out of a sense of perceived identity, who I am, who I think I am, who I think everything is. And on that foundation, I desire, on a foundation of avidya or vidya, ignorance or knowledge. So for a moment, I'd like to concentrate here on this idea of desire, because it's a very interesting point that not only Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upaniṣad makes, but we also find it in another scriptures. For example, in the Rig Veda, again, the oldest Veda that we know. Here we are going to the most ancient revelation in the Vedic tradition. So the Rig Veda says kamas tadagresam avartatadi manaso rattaha. In the beginning, there was desire, which was the first seed in the mind of God. That's implication. In other traditions, like the biblical tradition, they will say, in the beginning was the Word, and God and the Word was one. So here, in the beginning was desire, an interesting perspective. Of course, in the beginning, in our particular tradition, we may not talk about any beginning. Everything exists eternally, though there are beginnings and ends of cycles. So at the beginning, as a figurative way of explaining what's the underlying principle behind the whole unfolding of creation and of reality. Again, our mind needs to think in terms of beginnings and ends sometimes. So from that perspective, scripture relates to our present limitation and perspectives. So it speaks in terms of beginning. Okay, let's think about the beginning, like if everything started at one point. Like if we started at one point, like if the world started at one point, if that suits the mind a little bit, okay. What's that first thing that was there in the beginning? Kama, which is an important word. We have talked about that in other meetings. Kama doesn't necessarily mean lust or sensual desire. It means desire in general. It can be in any direction. So desire can be sacred also, sacred desire. Here we are talking about in the beginning, there was desire in the mind of God. Of course, that desire has to be sacred if it's coming from God's mind. So in one sense, sacred desire stands as the primal force behind creation and behind the ongoing unfolding of reality. Desire is propelling the whole thing to continue to exist in an ever-evolvingness, as I like to speak. Even if we go up to the spiritual world, what keeps the whole thing going is desire. Desire to love, desire to please, desire to render pleasing service, loving service, and so on and so forth. Or we can use the expression holy dissatisfaction, if you will. So, and many times the Vedas depict that in the beginning there was one person, there was one entity, the undivisible divine, and there was some sense of dissatisfaction, and therefore the one became many. Ekubahusha. For the purpose of loving interaction. So desire, a type of holy dissatisfaction in terms of an inner call for further becoming. So going back to our verse from Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upaniṣad, we are made of desire. That's what the verse is saying, interestingly. Kāmamaya. Maya means one is made of. One is made of kama, of desire. Evāyaṃ puruṣa. The living being is indeed eva, made of desire. Sometimes we hear about this thinking, feeling, willing properties, faculties. So the question is, what do we do with our desire? What I'm desiring, and many times, of course, we can only desire as much as we have experience, as much as we know. Though I will say also there is some intuitive voice that speaks to us about our ultimate potential, because we are tatastha, we are souls which are made of potential. So who we are is all that we can be, and therefore in our very makeup there is some system, if you want to use that term, that whispers or constantly whispers to us about all that we can be, and which is the direction that could fully actualize our potential. That said, we may not be able to fully understand that whisper, to fully articulate that voice, if sometimes we don't find that same voice articulated in front of me, from outside of me in one sense, but in front of my eyes, and reflecting my own inner voice. And that's what we will call the principle of satsanga, or the principle of guru. Our own potential appearing in front of us, our own inner voice whispering about all that we could be, and that sometimes we are not able to listen, or we don't even believe it, sounds too good to be true, whatever the case. And when that same intuitive voice, that same whisper of potential appears embodied in front of us in the form of a particular person, a particular experience, life circumstance, then we receive a further confirmation about all that we can be, about how we can desire in the best possible way, how we can desire in the deepest, broadest way, which takes to the deepest, broadest intention, which takes to the deepest, broadest action, which takes to the deepest, broadest fruit. Phalena farichyate. You judge the tree according to the fruit. So we want all in particular fruit in life, but that depends on how we are acting. But how we are acting depends on which intentions are behind the action. It's not the action itself. And our intentions depend on which is the desire that is propelling this whole sequence. So the invitation for today is to deeply reflect on this. So you can please share in your comments, the comment section, which are your thoughts in this connection, and how you think we can refine our desire. How is your own experience of discovering a new way of desiring, not necessarily canceling desire, killing desire, but redeeming the whole, redefining the whole implications of what it means to be a being made of desire and how that can take us to our fullest fruit in life. So, thank you so much. See you next week for our next meeting.